All right, welcome to This Explainer. Okay, I want you to take a quick second and just picture the absolute last thing you bought. Seriously, think about it. It could be that morning cup of coffee, a new pair of headphones you snagged online, or, just a pack of gum at the grocery store checkout. You got it in your mind? Good, because today we're going on a little journey into the psychology of your everyday choices. We're going to look into what I like to call the shopper's mirror to unlock the actual secrets of buyer behavior. So ask yourself, why did you buy that specific item? Were you hooked by some flashy ad? Actually, maybe a friend recommended it? Or was it just a totally impulsive grab right at the checkout line? Framing this core question, why did you buy that, kind of turns our daily habits into a personal mystery. And in this explainer, we're going to solve that mystery together using the real science of buyer behavior. Here is our roadmap for exploring the invisible strings guiding your purchases. We'll be hitting the psychology of buying, buyer versus consumer, cultural and social influences, personal and economic realities, psychological drivers, and finally, real-world buyer behavior. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Psychology of Buying, Defining the Core Concept.
So, according to marketing legend Professor Philip Kotler, buying behavior is the decision process and acts of customers involved in buying and using products. Which means it's not just that final swipe of the credit card. It is the entire, complex cognitive journey that leads up to that exact moment. To put that academic definition into plain English, buyer behavior is simply the underlying psychology of what, when, how, and why we purchase. It is literally the driving force behind every single market process on the planet. Marketers study this obsessively because understanding what drives a buyer to act is basically the only way a business can survive, grow, and actually excel. All right, Section 2, Buyer versus Consumer, the identity split. Now, there is a massive distinction between a buyer and a consumer. A buyer is the person who actually drops the cash and purchases the product. Their purpose could be to consume it themselves or even resell it. A consumer, on the other hand, is the ultimate end user. They just consume it. Let me give you a really relatable story to illustrate this. Imagine a guy buying a pair of shoes for his son, Ram. The dad is the buyer, right? But Ram is the actual consumer. Now, if the dad buys those shoes for himself, boom, he is both the buyer and the consumer. It sounds super simple, but understanding this split completely changes how companies market their products. Moving on to Section 3, Cultural and Social Influences, the Matrix of Determinants. There are 5 major categories, or determinants, that affect buyer behavior: cultural, social, personal, psychological, and economical. Every single purchase you make is filtered through these 5 branches. Think of it like a giant psychological puzzle. Let's start with cultural factors. This includes your overarching culture, subcultures like geography or religion, and of course, your social class. These dictate your most basic, fundamental preferences. They're the ethics, values, and wants you absorb just by observing your family and the ecosystem around you. For example, your social class, which is determined by things like education, wealth, and occupation, heavily influences what you buy. Think about how a brand like Apple specifically targets consumers in a higher income social class. That's cultural targeting in action. Then we have social factors. Family is actually considered the strongest factor impacting a person's decision. But it's also about your reference groups, the friends, colleagues, and neighbors whose opinions really matter to you. Let me ask you, have you ever had a friend convince you to buy an iPhone instead of an Android, literally just so you wouldn't be a green bubble in the group chat? We've all been there. That is a social factor overriding almost everything else. It also includes your role and status in society, like being a teacher versus being a corporate executive. Section 4. Personal and economic realities, life stages and wallets. Age completely transforms our buying habits over our life cycle. When you're in your youth, you might drop all your money on flashy, fashionable clothes, but transition into adulthood, and suddenly you're buying occupation-based attire, suits, scrubs, uniforms, you name it. Fast forward to old age, and the preference shifts entirely towards comfortable, simple attire. You're the exact same person, but your buying behavior has completely mutated based on your age. Beyond age, personal factors include your income, your occupation, your lifestyle, and your unique personality traits. If you decide to adopt a super healthy lifestyle, your grocery cart suddenly fills up with organic produce instead of junk food. Or take occupation. A doctor is going to have vastly different day-to-day purchasing needs than, say, a freelance graphic designer. But of course, affordability is the ultimate gatekeeper. For economic factors, personal and family income dictate if a product is even within your reach. Your liquid assets, basically how much cash you have on hand, drive immediate purchases. What's really fascinating today, though, is consumer credit. Things like zero-cost EMIs from companies like Bajaj Finance, they completely rewrite a buyer's economic reality. It shifts the psychology to buy now, pay later, allowing consumers to act on desires they previously just couldn't afford. All right, Section 5, the psychological drivers inside the mind. There are 4 internal psychological quadrants at play here: motivation, perception, learning, and attitude. These are the unseen gears turning in your head every single time you walk down a store aisle. Let's contrast the first two. Motivation is all about unfulfilled needs driving you to act from within. It could be physiological, safety, or esteem needs. But once a need is fulfilled, it stops motivating you. Perception, on the other hand, comes from the outside in. It's the image formed in your mind by external advertisements or reading Amazon reviews. You form a perception of a brand long before you ever actually touch the physical product. The final two are learning and attitude. See, buying is an ongoing learning process. You use cognitive learning to evaluate if a past purchase actually satisfied you, and social learning to imitate the buying behaviors of others you admire. Over time, all of this solidifies into your attitude, your existing, deeply rooted beliefs about a brand. And let me tell you, marketers spend billions trying to launch campaigns that can modify those existing attitudes in their favor. Which brings us to Section 6, real-world buyer behavior, brands in action. Check out this brilliant case study from Imami. They noticed a cultural and psychological shift. Men increasingly wanted to look younger and stylish. Instead of just guessing, they looked at an AC Nielsen survey showing that, hey, every second Indian man in major metros was actually visiting a beauty salon monthly. Imami took this social learning, hit the nail on the head, and launched Fair and Handsome. They specifically created a whole new market for male grooming products by identifying a new motivation and capitalizing on it perfectly. Then we have a massive B2B example, Wipro. When dealing with complex corporate buyer behavior, Wipro uses an outside-in approach. They heavily leverage social learning platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and industry vlogs. By building communities with their corporate clients and influencers, they tap directly into the social factors and reference groups of their buyers. They're constantly tracking the attitudes and learning processes of their clients to anticipate technological demands before the client even realizes they have a need. Pretty genius, right? And that brings us to the end of our journey through the shopper's mirror. We've seen how that distinction between buyer and consumer really matters, and how cultural, social, personal, economic, and psychological strings are constantly pulling at us. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. Next time you reach for your wallet to make a purchase, who is really making the decision? Is it you? Or is it your social class, your reference group, and a carefully crafted brand perception? Keep an eye out for those invisible strengths. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.